I was released from my deployment a day early, and when I came home, I saw my wife and her helpful boss in our bed kissing aggressively. I left without a word, blocked all the cards, and changed the locks. But then something happened that no one expected. Wife's 467 missed calls. You know that feeling when you think you're about to walk into the best surprise of your life, but instead you're walking straight into a horror movie? Yeah. Well, welcome to my Tuesday night from hell. So, there I was, sitting in this cramped airline seat that probably cost more than most people's rent, trying not to lose my mind over the fact that some kid behind me had been kicking my seat for the last 4 hours like he was auditioning for the Rockets. But hey, nothing could kill my mood because I had a secret weapon. I was getting home a whole day early from deployment. 24 glorious hours ahead of schedule, which in military time basically means you've won the lottery and found a unicorn in the same day. The brass had cut us loose early because, and I quote, operational objectives were met ahead of schedule. Translation: we did our job so well that even the army couldn't find a reason to keep us sitting around in the desert eating MREs and pretending to enjoy it. Don't get me wrong, I love serving my country and all that patriotic stuff. But after 6 months of sand in places sand should never be, I was ready to kiss American soil and probably hug the first Starbucks barista I saw. The whole flight back, I kept thinking about Marissa, my wife, my beautiful, supposedly devoted wife, who had been sending me these sweet little care packages and tear-jerking letters about how much she missed me. How she was counting down the days until I came home. How she was planning this amazing welcome back dinner and had been sleeping in my old t-shirts because they still smelled like my cologne. Real Hallmark movie stuff. You know, the kind of romance that makes other guys jealous and makes you feel like maybe you actually won at life for once. I had this whole plan mapped out in my head during that endless flight. I'd grab a cab instead of calling her for a pickup, sneak up to the house, maybe hide behind some bushes like a creep until I could figure out the perfect moment to surprise her. I pictured her face when she opened the door and saw me standing there with my duffel bag and that stupid grin I get when I'm trying to be romantic. She'd probably scream, the good kind of scream, not that there's a serial killer at my door kind. And then jump into my arms like those cheesy military homecoming videos that make everyone cry on Facebook. Hell, I even practiced what I was going to say, something smooth like, miss me or maybe I couldn't stay away another day. I know I'm not exactly Shakespeare, but cut me some slack. I'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes in that tiny military bunk, I saw her smile, felt her arms around me. Heard her whisper, "You're finally home." In that way, that made me forget all about the bureaucratic nonsense and the sand, and the fact that military coffee tastes like it was filtered through a gym sock. The cab ride from the airport should have been my first clue that something was off. Not because of anything dramatic. The driver was actually pretty cool. Some older guy who kept thanking me for my service every 5 minutes, which was nice, even if it got a little repetitive. No, it was me that felt weird. The closer we got to home, the more this strange knot started forming in my stomach. You know that feeling when you're about to take a really important test and suddenly you can't remember if you studied the right chapters? It was like that, except I couldn't figure out what the hell I was supposed to be worried about. Maybe it was just deployment paranoia. 6 months of being on high alert 24/7 will mess with your head in ways you don't expect. Every shadow looks suspicious. Every unexpected sound makes you reach for a weapon that isn't there. And every good thing feels like it might be too good to be true. The army docs have fancy names for it. But basically, it boils down to your brain being convinced that peace and happiness are probably booby traps. But as we pulled into my neighborhood, our neighborhood with all those perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences that scream suburban dream achieved, I started to relax a little. Everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left. Mrs. Henderson still had those ridiculous garden gnomes that her homeowners association keeps trying to make her remove. The Johnsons still hadn't fixed their mailbox that leans at a 45 degrees angle like it's giving everyone a casual salute. Normal, peaceful home. Then we turned onto my street and I saw our house. My house. The house I'd been dreaming about for 6 months. The house where my wife was probably curled up on the couch in her pajamas, maybe watching one of those reality TV shows she's addicted to, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was about to walk through the door and sweep her off her feet. But something was wrong with the picture. The upstairs lights were on, which was weird because Marissa always complained about the electric bill and had this whole routine about turning off every light in the house before going to bed. She used to joke that I married a woman who was part accountant, part environmentalist, and part drill sergeant when it came to household expenses. 2 cents saved is 2 cents earned, she'd say. Usually, while following me around the house, switching off lights I'd forgotten about. So, why were the upstairs lights blazing like she was hosting a rave up there? I paid the cab driver, grabbed my duffel bag, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring up at those bright windows. My chest was tight with something that wasn't quite excitement anymore, but wasn't quite dread either. It was that in-between feeling you get when you're about to open a door and you have no idea what's waiting on the other side. The smart thing would have been to call her, give her a heads up that I was home early, but where's the fun in that? I wanted to surprise her. Wanted to see that look of pure joy spread across her face when she realized her husband had managed to come home sooner than expected. I wanted to be the hero of my own love story for once instead of just another guy in combat boots trudging through someone else's war. So, I walked up that familiar driveway, past the flower beds Marissa had planted last spring, past the American flag I'd hung up before deployment, past all the little details that made this place home. My boots were quiet on the porch steps. Old habit from months of trying not to wake up half the barracks every time I moved. The spare key was still hidden under the fake rock by the door right where we'd left it. My hand was shaking just a little as I slid that key into the lock. 6 months of anticipation, 6 months of missing her, 6 months of counting down the days until this exact moment. I turned the key, pushed open the door, and stepped into what I thought would be the beginning of the best night of my life. Instead, I stepped into the beginning of the worst one. You ever have one of those moments where your brain just refuses to process what's happening? Like when you're watching a car accident in slow motion and part of you is thinking, this can't be real, while the other part is already calculating the damage. Yeah, well, welcome to my personal train wreck. Starring yours truly as the guy who should have just stayed in that damn cab. I stood in my own doorway like some kind of statue. Duffel bag still slung over my shoulder. Keys dangling from my hand like I'd forgotten how to use basic motor functions. The downstairs was dark. Not just dark, but that kind of staged darkness you see in those home invasion movies where everything's too quiet and too perfect. Like someone had arranged it specifically to mess with your head. Our living room looked exactly the same as when I'd left 6 months ago. Same couch where we used to binge watch Netflix until 3 o'clock in the morning, arguing about whether to start another episode or actually get some sleep. Same coffee table with that ring stain from the time Marissa forgot to use a coaster and spent 20 minutes apologizing like she'd committed a federal crime. Same family photos lined up on the mantle. All smiles and look how happy we are that now felt like evidence from a crime scene. But here's the thing about coming home from deployment. Your hearing gets weird. 6 months of listening for threats, for anything that doesn't belong, and suddenly you can hear a pin drop 3 rooms away. So when I heard the sounds coming from upstairs, every alarm bell in my head started going off like a fire drill in hell. Breathless laughter, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you know exactly what it means, even when your brain is still trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe she's watching a comedy show. Maybe she's on the phone with her sister. Maybe she's doing one of those online workout videos that make her giggle because the instructor has a funny accent. But then came the murmur. Low, deep, definitely male, and definitely not coming from a TV or a phone call. That's when my training kicked in. Not the how to be a good husband training, but the how to assess a threat without getting yourself killed training. Silent footsteps, controlled breathing, every muscle ready to react to whatever nightmare was waiting upstairs. I didn't call her name. What was I supposed to say? Honey, I'm home early. Hope you're not doing anything you shouldn't be doing. I didn't knock on the doorframe like some polite visitor in my own damn house. And I sure as hell didn't announce my presence like this was some kind of social call. No, I channeled every bit of stealth training the army had beaten into me and made my way to those stairs like my life depended on it. Each step felt like it took an hour. You know how in horror movies the music gets all dramatic and the camera does that slow motion thing while the victim walks toward their doom? It was exactly like that, except there was no dramatic music, just the sound of my own heartbeat trying to punch its way out of my chest and the increasingly obvious sounds of my wife doing things that wives aren't supposed to do when their husbands are deployed overseas fighting for freedom and democracy and all that patriotic crap. The stairs in our house creak. I'd forgotten about that during my months away. But now, every little groan of the woods sounded like a gunshot in the silence, step by step, like I was climbing toward my own execution, which I guess in a way I was. The execution of every belief I'd had about my marriage, my life, my ability to judge character, and my general faith in the idea that good things happen to people who try to do the right thing. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the sounds were unmistakable. I'm not going to spell it out for you because I'm not a masochist and this isn't some kind of twisted romance novel. But let's just say that my wife was definitely not alone, definitely not watching TV, and definitely not thinking about her husband, who was supposed to be thousands of miles away, missing her like an idiot. The bedroom door, our bedroom door, was cracked open just enough to give me a front row seat to the destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. And because the universe apparently has a sick sense of humor, There was just enough light from the bedside lamp to see everything in perfect crystal clear high-definition detail. Marissa, my wife, the woman who wore my dog tags around her neck in our wedding photos, and promised to love me in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, whether you're home or deployed, until death do us part. She was tangled up with some guy in what was supposed to be our bed, our sanctuary, our place. And she was kissing him like her life depended on it, like he was water. And she'd been dying of thirst. Like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. But here's the kicker. I knew the guy, Charles Cadden, her boss from that marketing firm downtown. The same Charles Cadden she'd mentioned in her letters. Always in passing, always with some innocent little story about work drama or office politics. Charles thinks we should restructure the campaign. Charles brought donuts for everyone today. Charles is such a great mentor. Yeah, well, Charles was mentoring her in a lot more than marketing strategies, apparently. I'd met him at the company Christmas party before my deployment. Shook his hand, listened to him thank me for my service, watched him smile at Marissa with what I thought was just professional friendliness. Guy seemed decent enough. Married himself. Couple of kids. One of those suburban dad types who probably coached Little League on weekends and drove a sensible sedan. The kind of man you'd never suspect of screwing around with someone else's wife while that someone else was overseas getting shot at by people who wanted to kill Americans. They were so caught up in their little love scene that they hadn't heard me come home, hadn't heard me climb the stairs, hadn't noticed that the husband they were betraying was standing 10 feet away watching his entire world collapse in real time. And you know what the worst part was? They looked happy, not guilty, not sneaky, not like two people who knew they were doing something horrible. They looked like two people who belonged together, who fit, who made sense. My wedding photo was sitting right there on the nightstand. The same photo that used to make me smile every time I looked at it. Marissa in her white dress, me in my dress uniform. Both of us grinning like we just won the lottery. Except now it looked like the picture had turned away in shame. Tilted at an angle like it couldn't bear to witness what was happening in the bed it was supposed to be watching over. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching my marriage die in front of my eyes. Part of me wanted to kick down the door, start screaming, maybe throw Charles out the window, and give Marissa a piece of my mind that she'd never forget. Part of me wanted to break down, crying right there in the hallway, just collapse, and let the grief wash over me like a tidal wave. But you know what I did instead? I turned around, walked back down those creaking stairs, stepped out of that house like I was stepping out of my old life entirely. And I closed the door behind me quietly, carefully, like I was trying not to wake anyone up because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do isn't making noise. Sometimes it's making no noise at all. You know what's funny about life-changing moments? They don't come with a soundtrack or dramatic lighting or any of that Hollywood, they just happen usually when you're least prepared for them. And suddenly, you're standing on the other side of everything you thought you knew about yourself. One minute you're a happily married soldier coming home to surprise his loving wife, and the next minute you're a guy who just watched his entire world get flushed down the toilet by the two people he trusted most. The cab was still sitting there when I walked back outside. Same driver, same meter running, same everything. Except now I was a completely different person than the hopeful idiot who'd gotten out of that car 5 minutes earlier. Funny how fast things can change when you're not paying attention. I slid into the back seat like I was moving through water. Everything feeling slow and surreal and not quite connected to reality. My duffel bag landed beside me with the same thud it had made earlier. But now it felt heavier somehow, like it was weighted down with all the expectations and dreams that had just gotten crushed upstairs in what used to be my bedroom. The driver turned around and looked at me with those kind eyes that cab drivers get when they've seen enough of life to recognize when someone's having the worst day of their existence. "Everything okay, man?" he asked. And I could tell he genuinely cared about the answer. Probably had kids of his own. Probably knew what it felt like to worry about someone you loved. Hell, maybe he'd been deployed himself at some point and understood the particular brand of homesickness that comes with military service. For a second, I almost told him. Almost spilled the whole pathetic story right there in the back of his cab. How I'd been counting down the days. How I'd planned this perfect surprise. How I'd walked in on my wife screwing her boss in the bed I'd bought with my deployment pay. Almost broke down like some kind of emotional train wreck and let this stranger comfort me while I processed the fact that my marriage was dead than disco. But you know what deployment teaches you? It teaches you that sometimes the only thing standing between you and complete chaos is your ability to keep your mouth shut and figure out your next move. When mortars are raining down and your buddy's been hit and everything's going to hell around you, you don't have the luxury of falling apart. You assess the situation, you make a plan, and you execute that plan with whatever resources you have available. So instead of having a breakdown in the back of a cab, I looked at this decent guy who was just trying to do his job and said the only thing that made sense downtown. My voice sounded weird, too calm, too controlled, like it was coming from someone else entirely. The kind of calm that only happens when something inside you is snapped back into place. When all the emotional gets pushed aside and you start thinking like a soldier again instead of like a heartbroken husband. The driver gave me another look, probably trying to figure out if I was about to do something crazy or dangerous. But apparently, I passed whatever mental health check he was running because he just nodded and put the car in drive. "You got it, buddy." As we pulled away from my house, former house, I guess, I found myself staring out the window at all those perfect suburban homes with their perfect suburban families doing their perfect suburban things. Porch lights glowing like beacons of domestic bliss. TVs flickering through living room windows, probably showing sitcoms or cooking shows or whatever normal people watch when their lives aren't imploding in real time. Mrs. Henderson was watering her ridiculous garden gnomes again because apparently that's what you do at 9 o'clock at night when you have nothing better to worry about than keeping your lawn decorations properly hydrated. The Johnsons had their entire family squeezed onto their front porch swing, looking like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Even the teenagers hanging out under the street light looked like they belonged in some heartwarming commercial about growing up in small-town America. And there I was, driving away from all of it like some kind of ghost, like I'd never belonged in that picture-perfect neighborhood in the first place. Which, let's be honest, maybe I never had. Maybe I'd been kidding myself this whole time, thinking I could come back from war zones and hostile environments and just slip back into civilian life, like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes. The thing about deployment is that it changes you in ways you don't expect. Not just the obvious stuff, the hypervigilance, the difficulty sleeping, the way loud noises make you want to hit the deck. It's the subtler changes that really get you. The way you start to see through people's because you've spent months depending on your ability to read situations accurately. The way you learn to trust your instincts because hesitation can get you killed. The way you realize that most of the things people worry about back home are completely meaningless when you've seen what real problems actually look like. Maybe that's why I wasn't screaming or crying or punching the back of the cab driver's seat. Maybe 6 months of staying alive in a war zone had taught me that emotional reactions are luxuries you can't afford when you need to think clearly. Maybe I'd learned something about myself that I never would have discovered if I'd stayed home and played house with a woman who was apparently playing house with someone else. The city lights started getting brighter as we headed downtown. All those neon signs and office buildings and late-night diners that stay open for people who have nowhere else to go. I'd always thought of downtown as the place you visited when you wanted excitement. When suburban life got too boring and you needed a taste of something different. Now it felt like exactly where I belonged. Anonymous, temporary, full of people who were between one thing and the next. Anywhere specific downtown? The driver asked, glancing at me in the rear view mirror. I almost laughed at that. Anywhere specific? Like I had a plan, like I'd thought this through, like I was some kind of master strategist who'd anticipated coming home early to find his wife in bed with her boss. The truth was I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house. Couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Couldn't go back to being the naive husband who thought his marriage was solid just because he'd been getting sweet letters and care packages. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It's actually a pretty solid foundation to build on. When everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie. When every assumption you'd made about your life gets proven wrong in the span of 5 minutes. You've got two choices. You can fall apart or you can start over. And I'd spent too many months in hostile territory to fall apart now. Just drive, I told him. I'll know it when I see it. The cab rolled through the downtown streets while I sat in the back seat, duffel bag beside me, wedding ring still on my finger, thinking about chaos and silence and the difference between reacting and responding. Deployment had taught me that when everything goes to hell, the person who stays calm usually wins. Time to find out if that lesson applied to civilian life, too. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, turns out I'd been meal prepping for months without even knowing it. While I was overseas playing soldier and writing sappy letters to my cheating wife, some paranoid little voice in the back of my head had been whispering what-if scenarios that I dismissed as trust issues and deployment anxiety. Turns out that paranoid little voice was the smartest part of me. Marcus Levin's law office sits in one of those downtown buildings that tries really hard to look impressive, but mostly just looks expensive. All marble and mahogany and the kind of furniture that screams. We charge by the hour and we're worth every penny. I'd been there exactly once before when Marissa and I bought the house and needed someone to handle the paperwork. Back then, Marcus had seemed like overkill for a simple real estate transaction, but my dad always said, get the best lawyer you can afford, then figure out how to afford a better one. Now, I was sitting across from his massive desk at 8 o'clock in the morning, looking like I'd slept in my uniform, which I had, in a downtown hotel room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. While Marcus stared at the folder I just dropped in front of him, like it contained nuclear launch codes. "You already moved everything?" he asked, flipping through page after page of bank statements, property deeds, trust documents, and financial transfers that I'd been working on for months. His eyebrows kept climbing higher up his forehead with each document, like he was watching a magic trick he couldn't figure out. I nodded once, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. "Started the process 3 months ago." 3 months ago, he repeated slowly like he was trying to process the timeline. "You've been planning this since I started getting suspicious," I said, which was technically true. "I've been getting suspicious." "All right. Not about Marissa specifically, but about the general idea that anything good in my life could last without proper backup plans. Military thinking, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and always have an exit strategy. The thing is, I hadn't actually suspected Marissa of cheating when I started moving assets around. I'd just been thinking about divorce statistics for military couples, about how many guys come back from deployment to find their entire lives dismantled, about how many wives decide that being married to a soldier is too hard and too lonely and too unpredictable. So, I'd started protecting myself just in case, moving money into accounts she didn't know about, shifting property titles into trusts she wasn't aware of. Basically, building a financial firewall around everything I'd worked for. I told myself it was just good planning, like buying life insurance or keeping emergency supplies. You don't do it because you expect disaster. You do it because disaster has a way of showing up when you're least prepared for it. And if disaster never comes, well, no harm done. You just have really good financial organization and some impressive paperwork." Turns out disaster had a name, and it was Charles Cadden. Marcus was still flipping through documents, occasionally making those little H sounds that lawyers make when they're either really impressed or really confused. "This is comprehensive," he said. "Finally, the house is entirely in your name through the trust. The bank accounts have been transferred. The investments are secured, even the cars, both registered to the trust," I confirmed. "She's been driving around in vehicles she technically doesn't own for the last 2 months." He looked up at me with something that might have been respect or might have been mild fear. "How did you know?" "I didn't," I said, which was the truth, but not the whole truth. "I just believe in being prepared." What I didn't tell him was that deployment gives you a lot of time to think. And thinking gives you a lot of time to realize how vulnerable you are when your entire life is built on trust and assumptions. How easy it would be for someone to destroy everything you've worked for while you're on the other side of the world, unable to protect yourself or your interests. How many guys I'd served with had come home to find their wives had cleaned out bank accounts, sold houses, maxed out credit cards, and disappeared with new boyfriends who appreciated women who came with built-in financial benefits. So, I'd started making moves, quiet moves, legal moves, moves that looked like financial planning, but were actually more like building a fortress around everything that mattered to me. Opening new accounts in my name only, creating trusts that protected assets from marital division, rerouting direct deposits and automatic payments. Basically, I'd spent 3 months turning myself into a financial ghost, someone who existed on paper but couldn't be touched by the kind of betrayal I was apparently destined for. The beauty of it, I explained to Marcus, who was still staring at my paperwork like it was written in hieroglyphics, is that everything was done legally with proper documentation while I was overseas serving my country. Hard to argue that a deployed soldier was acting in bad faith when he was protecting assets he'd earned through military service. Marcus started laughing. Not the kind of laugh you hear at comedy clubs, but the kind of laugh lawyers get when they realize they're looking at a case that's already won before it started. "She's going to contest this," he said. "She's going to claim fraud, manipulation, that you hid assets." "With what money?" I asked. "Her personal accounts have exactly enough to cover her cell phone bill and maybe a trip to Starbucks. Her credit cards are maxed out from shopping sprees. She thought I didn't know about. And her boss is about to have bigger problems than helping his side piece hire legal representation." That's when I pulled out the second folder, the one I'd been saving for dessert. Photos of Charles's car in our driveway at suspicious hours. Screenshots of text messages between them that I'd recovered from our shared cloud storage because apparently neither of them had figured out how technology actually works. Hotel receipts from business trips that coincidentally happened during my rare phone calls home. Email exchanges that started professional and ended up reading like bad romance novel excerpts. "You're going to destroy them," Marcus said. And for the first time since I'd known him, he actually sounded impressed instead of just professionally polite. "No." I corrected him, leaning back in the overpriced leather chair and feeling something like peace settle over me for the first time in hours. "I'm going to let them destroy themselves." I'm just going to make sure the process is properly documented because here's what I learned overseas. The best battles are the ones where your enemy defeats themselves while you watch from a safe distance. You don't have to fire a shot. Don't have to get your hands dirty. Don't have to compromise your principles or your position. You just have to be patient, prepared, and smart enough to stay out of the way when everything collapses. Divorce papers filed today, I told Marcus. And I want the locks changed by tonight. Consider it done, he said, already reaching for his phone to start making calls. Anything else? I stood up, grabbed my duffel bag, and headed for the door. Yeah, I said over my shoulder. Make it hurt. You ever watch one of those home improvement shows where they renovate someone's entire house in like 48 hours? Well, turns out dismantling someone's entire life takes about the same amount of time. Except it's way more satisfying and nobody has to pretend to be excited about the big reveal. By the time the sun started setting, I had more contractors at my house than a reality TV makeover. The locksmith, this grizzled old guy named Eddie, who looked like he'd been changing locks since the Civil War, was working on the front door while I supervised from the driveway like some kind of domestic operations commander. Behind him, a tech guy from the security company was reprogramming the garage door opener, and another specialist was updating the alarm system codes. You sure about all this, son? Eddie asked, drilling out the old deadbolt with the efficiency of someone who'd probably helped a lot of people lock out a lot of other people over the years. Seems like a lot of work for one afternoon, I'm sure, I told him, watching him install a new lock that came with keys Marissa had never seen and would never see. How long have you been doing this job, Eddie? 37 years come October, he said, not looking up from his work. Seen a lot of folks change their locks for a lot of reasons. Divorce, breakups, roommate drama, family disputes. Hell, I once changed locks for a lady who wanted to keep her mother-in-law out of her kitchen. Ever changed locks for a deployed soldier who came home early to find his wife entertaining company? Eddie stopped drilling and looked at me with the kind of expression you see on the faces of people who've heard every story there is to hear. Can't say that I have, he said quietly. But I'm guessing this company wasn't the invited kind. You could say that. He nodded and went back to work, not asking any more questions because guys like Eddie understand that sometimes the less you know about your customer's business, the better you sleep at night. But I could tell he was on my side from the way he was being extra thorough with the installation, making sure every screw was tight and every mechanism was smooth as silk. While Eddie handled the physical security, I was busy handling the financial warfare from my phone. Bank after bank, account after account, credit card after credit card. Yes, I'd like to freeze this account immediately. No, I don't need to discuss it with the joint account holder. That's correct. I'm removing her authorization as of right now. Military service member. Yes. Fraud protection. Exactly. It's amazing how cooperative financial institutions get when you use the magic words military service member and potential fraud. Suddenly, everyone's bending over backward to help you protect your assets. Probably because they've seen this movie before and they know how it ends. Deployed soldier gets screwed over by cheating spouse. Bank gets sued for not protecting service members' interests. Bank pays out massive settlement and gets terrible publicity. Much easier to just freeze everything and let the lawyers sort it out later. The joint checking account frozen. The savings account that was supposed to be for our future house down payment frozen. The credit card she'd been using for those girls' nights out that apparently included Charles Cannell. Even that store credit card she'd gotten for furniture shopping, the one she thought I didn't know about, gone. But the real masterpiece was the SUV. That beautiful, overpriced, payments higher than most people's rent SUV that Marissa had insisted we needed because it's an investment in our future, and we'll need the space when we start having kids. The same SUV she'd been driving to meet Charles for their little romantic renvous. Probably thinking she was so clever, so untouchable, so secure in her perfect little double life. I called the dealership while Eddie was installing the new deadbolt. Hey, this is about the 2024 Escalade account number. I rattled off the details. Yeah, I need to report it as let's call it unauthorized use. The primary account holder is requesting immediate repossession. Sir, are you sure? That's going to leave the secondary driver without transportation. That's exactly the point, I said, watching the security tech finish up with the garage door. How soon can you pick it up? We can have a truck there within 2 hours. Perfect. And just so we're clear, the secondary driver is no longer authorized to make any decisions about this vehicle. Any attempts to contact her about payments or account status should be directed to my attorney. I gave them Marcus information and hung up, feeling like a chess player who just put his opponent in check without them even realizing the game had started. By the time the contractors finished up, my house looked exactly the same from the outside, but was completely different on the inside. New locks, New codes, new everything. The birthday I'd used for the alarm system, Marissa's birthday, was gone, replaced with the date I'd enlisted. The garage door opener she'd programmed to her car, reprogrammed to a frequency she'd never guess. Even the smart lock on the back door had been reset to recognize only my fingerprint. All set, Eddie said, handing me a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have. Nobody's getting in here without your permission. What do I owe you on the house? He said, packing up his tools with military-like efficiency. Thank you for your service, son. And for what it's worth, she's an idiot. After everyone left, I stood in my newly secured house, listening to the silence that felt different now. Not empty, but clean. Like I just completed the most important mission of my military career. Except this time, the enemy had been my own naive assumptions about love and loyalty and the idea that some things are sacred enough to survive anything. My phone started buzzing around 10 p.m. First a few calls, then more, then a steady stream of notifications that I ignored with the dedication of a professional. Marissa was probably just getting home from her romantic evening with Charles. Probably just discovering that her key didn't work anymore and her garage door remote had mysteriously stopped functioning. I made myself a sandwich and sat down to wait for the real show to begin. There's something deeply satisfying about watching your carefully laid plans come together like a perfectly executed military operation, especially when the targets have no idea they're walking straight into the trap you've spent months setting. It's like watching a nature documentary where the gazelle wanders right up to the lion. Except in this case, the gazelle was my cheating wife and her scumbag boss. And the lion was the sweet, sweet justice they were about to get served with a side of public humiliation. Marcus and I parked across the street from what used to be my house around 2 in the afternoon, sitting in his black BMW, like a couple of detectives on a stakeout. He'd brought coffee and donuts from that fancy place downtown, the kind that charges $8 for what's basically sugar and caffeine, but tastes like it was made by angels. I had to admit, for a lawyer who usually dealt with boring corporate stuff, Marcus was really getting into the whole revenge operation thing. You sure you want to watch this? He asked, adjusting his rear view mirror to get a better view of the front porch. Sometimes it's better to just let karma do its thing from a distance. Are you kidding me? I said, taking a sip of overpriced coffee that was actually worth every penny. I've been deployed for 6 months. This is the best entertainment I've had since that time our sergeant got stuck in a portiati during a sandstorm. We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:47 p.m., I know because I was timing everything like this was a tactical exercise, a familiar silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Marissa's temporary ride, borrowed from her sister because apparently her precious SUV had mysteriously vanished sometime during the night. She stepped out wearing that little black dress I bought her for our anniversary. The one she said made her feel sophisticated and powerful. Guess she was feeling sophisticated and powerful. All right, just not with her husband. And there was Charles getting out of the passenger side like he owned the place, straightening his tie, and checking his watch like this was just another business meeting instead of an afternoon booty call at his employee's house. The guy had the nerve to look relaxed, confident even, like he'd been doing this for so long that he'd forgotten it was technically adultery and morally reprehensible behavior. They walked up my front walkway holding hands. Holding hands like they were some kind of legitimate couple instead of two people who'd been lying and sneaking around behind my back for God knows how long. Marissa was laughing at something Charles had said, throwing her head back in that way she used to do when I told her jokes that weren't even that funny. The same laugh that used to make me feel like the funniest guy in the world was now making my stomach turn because she was wasting it on someone who didn't deserve it. Here we go. Marcus said, leaning forward in his seat like he was watching the season finale of his favorite TV show. Marissa reached into her purse and pulled out her house key. The same key she'd been using for 3 years. The same key that used to symbolize home and trust and the life we'd built together. She slid it into the lock with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to walk into that house and do whatever the hell she wanted. Nothing happened. She tried again, jiggling the key like maybe she'd just inserted it wrong the first time. Still nothing. I watched her face change from confusion to concern to the first flickerings of panic as she realized that something was very, very wrong. That's weird, she said loud enough for us to hear from across the street. The key's not working. Charles stepped up like the gentleman he pretended to be, probably figuring that his superior masculine lock-picking skills would save the day. He took the key from Marissa and tried it himself, putting more force behind it, turning it harder, like the lock was just being stubborn and needed a firm hand to cooperate. Also, nothing. Did you get the lock changed? Charles asked, which was honestly a pretty stupid question considering Marissa had been living there right up until the night before and would obviously know if the locks had been changed. No, Marissa said, and I could hear the confusion in her voice starting to turn into something more like fear. I don't understand. This is my house. Wrong, sweetheart. Used to be your house. Now it's the house you used to live in before you decided to turn it into a love nest for you and your boss. They spent the next 10 minutes trying everything they could think of. Different keys from Marissa's keychain because maybe she'd grabbed the wrong one by mistake. The spare key hidden under the fake rock. Except, whoops, that lock had been changed, too. Even the back door, which they discovered was also newly secured when Charles tried to sneak around the side of the house like some kind of suburban burglar. That's when the pounding started. First just knocking, then actual pounding, then full-on beating the door like they were trying to break it down with their bare hands. "Open the door," Marissa screamed, her voice cracking with the kind of desperation you usually only hear in horror movies. "I live here. This is my house." My phone started buzzing once, twice, then constantly, like someone was holding down the call button and refusing to let go. Marissa's name kept flashing on the screen along with increasingly frantic text messages that I could see previews of without opening. "Where are you? Call me now. Something's wrong with the house." I looked at Marcus, who was watching the whole scene with the fascination of someone witnessing a car crash in slow motion. "You going to answer that?" he asked. "Nope," I said, taking another sip of my excellent coffee and settling back to enjoy the show. "I'm deployed, remember? No cell service where I am." By the time we finally drove away an hour later, Marissa was sitting on the porch steps crying like her world had just ended, which to be fair, it pretty much had. Charles was standing awkwardly beside her, probably realizing that his fun little side piece had just become a massive liability that could destroy his career, his marriage, and his comfortable suburban life. The last thing I saw in the rear-view mirror was Charles walking back to the car alone, leaving Marissa sitting there on the porch of the house she could no longer enter, surrounded by the ruins of the life she'd thrown away for a few months of excitement. Checkmate indeed. You know what's beautiful about a well-executed plan? It's like watching dominoes fall. Once you tip the first one, everything else happens automatically with a kind of mathematical precision that would make a physics professor weep with joy. And let me tell you, watching my ex-wife's life collapse in real time was better than any fireworks show I'd ever seen, including that 4th of July display at Fort Bragg where they accidentally set the entire field on fire. I was sitting in the hotel cafe at 7 a.m. the next morning, nursing my third cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and orange that reminded me why I'd missed American mornings so much during deployment. The coffee here was decent. Not great, but a hell of a lot better than the stuff we'd been choking down overseas that tasted like it had been filtered through sand and regret. My phone was buzzing across the table like an angry wasp, vibrating so hard it was making little ripples in my coffee cup. 23 missed calls when I woke up. 46 by the time I finished my shower, 67 by the time I made it downstairs for breakfast. The numbers kept climbing like some kind of twisted lottery where the prize was getting to hear my cheating ex-wife lose her mind in real time. I picked up the phone just long enough to check the messages, not to answer them, obviously. The voicemail started out confused and worried. "Honey, where are you? Something's wrong with the house. Call me back." Then they got panicked. "I can't get into the house. The locks are different. What's happening?" Then they turned angry. "This is ridiculous. Call me right now." And finally, they devolved into the kind of desperate pleading that would have broken my heart 6 months ago, but now just sounded like white noise by the time I finished my eggs Benedict. And yes, I was treating myself to the fancy breakfast because what's the point of destroying your ex-wife's life if you can't enjoy some overpriced Holland sauce while you do it? The missed call counter had hit triple digits. 112 calls from a woman who apparently thought that dialing the same number over and over again would somehow change the fundamental laws of physics and make me materialize in front of her. But here's the thing about military training. It teaches you patience. Real patience. Not the fake kind where you're secretly counting to 10 and trying not to lose your temper. The kind of patience where you can sit completely still for hours waiting for exactly the right moment to move because you understand that timing is everything and premature action can ruin even the best laid plans. So, while Marissa was apparently having a complete meltdown in the parking lot of whatever hotel she'd ended up at, because according to her increasingly unhinged text messages, Charles had suddenly become unavailable and needed space to think, I was calmly filing paperwork that would turn her temporary homelessness into a permanent lifestyle change. First stop, the courthouse. Divorce petition filled out in triplicate with the efficiency of someone who'd been practicing military paperwork for years. Grounds for divorce. Adultery with photographic evidence attached. Asset division clearly outlined based on the trust documents that protected everything I'd earned before, during, and after our marriage. Spousal support. Hell no. Considering she'd been stealing from our joint accounts to fund her affair. The clerk looked at my paperwork with the kind of admiration usually reserved for perfectly executed drill formations. "This is very thorough," she said, stamping each page with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated attention to detail. "Your attorney did excellent work." "Thank you," I said, not mentioning that I'd done most of the prep work myself during those long nights overseas when I couldn't sleep and needed something productive to do with my insomnia. Next stop, restraining order. Because apparently Marissa had graduated from desperate phone calls to showing up at the hotel where I was staying, demanding answers and making enough noise to disturb the other guests. The hotel security footage of her screaming in the lobby at 6 a.m. was probably going to end up on one of those Karen freakout compilation videos, but it also made excellent evidence for a harassment claim. Then came my personal favorite, the fraud report. See, while I was overseas eating MREs and dodging hostile fire, Marissa had been using my military benefits to fund her little romance, dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to wine country, even jewelry that she'd claimed was a gift from her sister, but turned out to be charged to a credit card linked to my veterans account. Misuse of military benefits isn't just morally reprehensible. It's actually illegal with penalties that include fines, jail time, and a permanent record that follows you around like a bad smell. But wait, there's more. Because Charles wasn't getting out of this disaster unscathed while Marissa was busy having her public breakdown and probably Googling how to break into your own house, I was writing a very detailed, very professional letter to the corporate board of Charles's company. A letter that included time-stamped photos of his car in my driveway during business hours, screenshots of emails between him and Marissa discussing their lunch meetings that apparently lasted 3 hours and involved a lot more than discussing quarterly projections, and a comprehensive timeline of their workplace relationship that painted a very clear picture of sexual harassment, abuse of power, and misuse of company resources. The best part, Charles worked for one of those companies that takes workplace conduct very seriously. The kind of place that has mandatory seminars about appropriate professional relationships and zero-tolerance policies for managers who sleep with their employees. The kind of place where getting caught in an affair with a subordinate isn't just embarrassing, it's career suicide. By noon, I'd filed everything that needed filing, reported everything that needed reporting, and set in motion a chain of events that would systematically dismantle every aspect of the comfortable life that Marissa and Charles thought they could build on the foundation of my trust and naivety. The avalanche had officially begun, and I didn't have to push a single stone. I just had to sit back, enjoy my overpriced coffee, and watch gravity do what gravity does best. 467 missed calls by the end of the week, and I didn't answer a single one of them. Because sometimes the most devastating response isn't a response at all. You know what's worse than having a cheating wife? Having in-laws who think you're not good enough for their precious daughter, even when she's the one screwing around behind your back. The Whites, Philip, and Margaret, have been treating me like a discount son-in-law since day one. The kind of people who smile to your face at family dinners but spend the rest of the time whispering about how their daughter could have done better and settled too young. Well, it was time for the Whites to learn that sometimes the guy you look down on is the one who's been keeping your entire family afloat. Their house sits in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with nail scissors and every mailbox costs more than most people's cars. Old money vibes. Or at least the kind of fake old money vibes that come from Philip's middle management job at some insurance company and Margaret's part-time work at a boutique that sells scarves for $300 each. The kind of people who think having a cleaning lady twice a week makes them aristocracy. I pulled into their circular driveway at 10 a.m. on a Saturday because nothing says serious business like showing up when people are supposed to be relaxing in their pajamas and pretending their lives are perfect. My rental car, a basic sedan that probably cost less than Margaret's weekly manicure, looked hilariously out of place next to Philip's BMW and Margaret's Mercedes, both of which I happen to know were financed up to their chrome bumpers. The folder I carried looked innocent enough, just a manila envelope that could have contained anything from insurance documents to family photos. But inside was enough information to detonate their comfortable little world like a tactical nuke made of paperwork and uncomfortable truths. Margaret answered the door in full makeup and an outfit that probably took her an hour to put together because apparently even at home on Saturday morning, she needed to look like she was about to pose for a magazine cover about successful suburban living. Her smile was the same fake sweet expression she'd been giving me for 3 years. The one that said, "I'm being polite because I have to, but I'd rather be anywhere else." "Oh," she said, like finding me at her door was about as pleasant as discovering a raccoon in her garbage. "We weren't expecting you. Marissa said you weren't coming home until next week." "Plans changed," I said, holding up the folder. "Is Philip home? I need to talk to both of you about something important." She led me into their living room, which looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd watched too many home design shows and had more money than taste. Everything was white and beige and carefully arranged to look casual while actually being completely artificial. Philip was sitting in his leather recliner reading some financial magazine, probably pretending to understand stock market analysis while actually just looking at the pictures. "What's this about?" Philip asked, not bothering to get up or even lower his magazine completely. The same dismissive attitude he'd been giving me since the day I married his daughter, like I was some kind of hired help who'd forgotten his place. I sat down on their ridiculously expensive couch without being invited and opened the folder on their glass coffee table that probably cost more than my first car. "It's about your daughter," I said, laying out the first document. "And about the fact that you've both been living a lie for the last year." The first document was a bank statement showing payments from my account to their mortgage company. Not a loan, not a gift, not a temporary help-out situation. Regular monthly payments that had been going on for over a year, covering their house payment because apparently Philip's middle management salary wasn't quite covering their upper-class lifestyle. Margaret's fake smile disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. Philip's magazine slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a thud that echoed through their suddenly very quiet living room. "You've been paying our mortgage," Margaret whispered, staring at the bank statement like it was written in a foreign language, "for 14 months. I confirmed, laying out the next document. "Every month, like clockwork, while you two have been telling everyone who'd listen that I'm not good enough for your daughter and that she married beneath her station." The next document was even better. A detailed breakdown of every loan they'd asked for over the past 3 years, the car repair that turned into a full engine replacement, the roof work that somehow doubled in cost halfway through, the credit card payments I'd helped with during Philip's temporary cash flow problems that had lasted 8 months, all of it totaling up to a number that made Philip's face go white and Margaret's hands start shaking. "But the real kicker," I said, laying out the final set of documents like I was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game, "is what your precious daughter has been doing while I've been overseas keeping your family financially stable." These were the photos I'd been saving for special occasions. Charles's car in our driveway. Marissa and Charles holding hands outside restaurants I couldn't afford. Hotel receipts that corresponded exactly with days when she told me she was visiting her sick friend or working late on important projects. Text messages between them that started professional and ended up reading like the kind of romance novel that would make a porn star blush. The silence in that living room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Margaret was staring at a photo of her daughter kissing Charles in the parking lot of the Marriott downtown. Her perfect makeup starting to run as tears formed in her eyes. Philip was reading text messages between his daughter and her boss that included detailed plans for spending my deployment money on romantic getaways. "She's been stealing from our accounts," I continued, because apparently I was just getting warmed up. "Military benefits, savings, everything we'd built together. Using my deployment pay to fund her affair while writing me letters about how much she missed me and couldn't wait for me to come home." Margaret started crying. Not the pretty, delicate tears you see in movies, but the ugly body-shaking sobs of someone whose entire worldview just got demolished with photographic evidence. Philip just sat there staring at the documents like he was trying to wish them out of existence through sheer force of will. "Why are you showing us this?" Philip finally managed to ask. I stood up, gathered my papers, and headed for the door because I sat over my shoulder. "You spent 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough for your family. Turns out your family wasn't good enough for me." And I walked out, leaving them sitting in their expensive living room with the ruins of their perfect daughter's reputation scattered across their overpriced coffee table like confetti from the world's worst celebration. There's something almost artistic about watching someone's entire social media presence implode in real time. It's like performance art, except instead of pretentious gallery openings and overpriced wine, you get front row seats to the complete destruction of someone's carefully curated online persona. And let me tell you, Marissa's digital downfall was more entertaining than anything Netflix had to offer. It started about 2 weeks after the porch incident, when she apparently decided that her best strategy was to play the victim card harder than a professional poker player with a royal flush. She launched into this whole social media campaign about being abandoned and betrayed and left homeless by the man who promised to love and protect her. Real tearjerker stuff, complete with carefully staged photos of her looking sad and vulnerable in her new cramped apartment that she'd rented with what was left in her personal checking account. The apartment, by the way, was a real piece of work. I may have driven by once or twice, just to make sure she was settling into her new lifestyle appropriately. It was one of those complexes that advertises luxury living, but really means we painted everything beige and installed the cheapest possible fixtures while charging premium prices. The kind of place where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbor's Netflix shows and the parking lot always smells like someone's cooking fish in a microwave. Marissa's Instagram posts from her new home were comedy gold. Pictures of her tiny kitchenette with captions like, "Starting fresh in my cozy new space." Translation: I went from a 4-bedroom house to a studio apartment, and I'm pretending this was my choice. Photos of her walking to work with hashtags like #independentwoman and #newbeginnings carefully cropped to hide the fact that she was taking the bus because her SUV had mysteriously vanished and she couldn't afford car payments on her retail salary. Oh yeah, the job situation. Turns out that when your boss gets suspended for sexual harassment and misuse of company resources and you're the employee he was harassing and misusing resources with, your career prospects take a bit of a hit. The marketing firm where she'd been working Charles in more ways than one suddenly found reasons to restructure her position right out of existence. Amazing how that works. So there she was, 28 years old with a college degree and 3 years of marketing experience, working at some chain clothing store in the mall, folding sweaters and asking teenagers if they'd like to sign up for the store credit card. The same woman who used to brag about her corner office with a view and her important client presentations was now dealing with Black Friday shoppers and trying to meet sales quotas set by managers who were probably younger than her favorite pair of shoes. But the real entertainment was watching her try to maintain her victim narrative while her entire support system crumbled around her. See, the thing about affairs is that they don't happen in a vacuum. Other people always know, or at least suspect, and they're usually just being polite by pretending they don't see what's obvious to everyone with functioning eyes. Her friends started unfollowing her social media accounts one by one, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The same girlfriends who used to comment heart emojis on all her posts and invite her to wine nights and weekend trips suddenly became very busy with their own lives. Amazing how quickly people disappear when your drama becomes too messy to ignore and your social status drops below their comfort zone. Margaret stopped answering her calls after our little chat. Philip, who used to take Marissa's side in every family argument and treat me like the hired help at family gatherings, suddenly developed a very strong opinion about daughters who bite the hand that feeds them. Even her sister, the one who'd loaned her the car for that fateful afternoon, started making excuses about why she couldn't help with money or transportation or emotional support. The breaking point came when someone, and I'm definitely not saying it was me, but I'm also not saying it wasn't, left an anonymous comment on one of her more dramatic Facebook posts about being abandoned by the person who was supposed to protect her forever. The comment was simple, direct, and absolutely devastating. Didn't you cheat on your husband while he was serving overseas? 6 words, 26 characters, including spaces. One question that cut through all her carefully constructed victim narrative like a sword through tissue paper. The post disappeared within an hour, but screenshots live forever. And apparently someone had been paying attention to Marissa's story long enough to connect the dots between her sob story and the timeline of events that everyone in town was starting to piece together. Small communities love gossip almost as much as they love supporting military families. And a woman who cheats on her deployed husband doesn't get a lot of sympathy points, no matter how prettily she cries about it. Charles, meanwhile, was dealing with his own version of social media hell. His wife, remember her? The woman he'd been married to for 12 years, the mother of his 2 kids, the person he'd been betraying every time he showed up at my house to play house with my wife, had apparently received an anonymous package containing photos, text messages, and a detailed timeline of her husband's extracurricular activities. I may have heard through certain channels that she'd filed for divorce with extreme prejudice, taking the kids, and about half of everything Charles owned. Apparently, she'd also shared some of the more damning evidence with their mutual friends because Charles's social media presence went from successful marketing executive and family man to radio silence faster than you could say adultery clause. The corporate investigation at their company was apparently very thorough and very public. The kind of thing that gets whispered about in break rooms and discussed in hushed tones during lunch meetings. Charles went from corner office to suspension to pursuing other opportunities in about 3 weeks, which in corporate speak means we fired his ass so hard it left skid marks. By the end of the month, Marissa's online victim act had completely collapsed. No more sympathy comments, no more supportive messages, no more friends rallying around her cause. Just a woman in a studio apartment working retail, posting increasingly desperate updates about learning to be strong and finding herself that nobody was reading because nobody cared anymore. The internet had moved on to fresher drama, leaving Marissa to face the consequences of her choices in blessed anonymous silence, just the way I planned it. 1 year later, and let me tell you, hindsight really is 20/20. Especially when you're looking back on the best revenge story ever told while sipping coffee on the deck of your own lakeside cabin, watching the sunrise paint the water in colors that make you remember why life is actually pretty damn beautiful when you're not sharing it with lying, cheating, soul-sucking parasites. The cabin wasn't some grand mansion or anything. Just a modest place I'd found about 3 hours north of the city, far enough away from the suburban nightmare I'd escaped, but close enough to civilization that I could still get decent internet and food delivery when I didn't feel like cooking. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, A kitchen that actually worked and a view that made me understand why people write poetry about nature and solitude and finding peace in simple things. I bought it with the settlement money from the divorce because apparently when your wife commits fraud using military benefits while you're deployed, the courts tend to take a very dim view of her claims to marital assets. Who knew? The whole process had been smoother than a jazz saxophone solo. Thanks to all that prep work I'd done, and the fact that Marissa's legal representation consisted of some overworked public defender who'd probably never handled a military divorce, and definitely hadn't expected to go up against someone who documented everything with the precision of a Pentagon briefing. The irony was delicious. The money Marissa had stolen from our accounts, the military benefits she'd misused, the credit she destroyed, all of it had been recovered through legal channels and court-ordered restitution. Every month, like clockwork, a payment showed up in my account with her name on it. Money that she earned folding clothes and asking customers if they wanted to open a store credit card for an additional 10% off their purchase. But here's the thing that would have surprised the hell out of the angry, heartbroken guy who discovered his wife's betrayal a year ago. I wasn't using that money for revenge fantasies or expensive toys or anything that would have given Marissa the satisfaction of knowing she was still affecting my life. Instead, every penny of her restitution payments went straight into a nonprofit I'd started for struggling veterans. Guys coming back from deployment to find their lives as screwed up as mine had been, just without the benefit of paranoid financial planning. Second Chances for Service members wasn't going to win any awards for creative naming, but it was helping real people deal with real problems. Guys who came home to find their wives had emptied bank accounts, sold houses, maxed out credit cards. Women who'd been financially abused by partners who thought military deployment meant open season on joint assets. Soldiers dealing with PTSD, unemployment, homelessness, addiction, all the fun stuff that nobody talks about in those patriotic commercials about supporting our troops. The monthly board meetings were held via video conference from my deck. Because one of the advantages of running your own nonprofit is that you get to set the dress code and jeans and a t-shirt while sitting next to a lake is definitely my preferred uniform for discussing budget allocations and program effectiveness. We're up to 43 families assisted this quarter, reported Sarah, our program coordinator, who was probably young enough to be my little sister, but had more organizational skills than most generals I'd served under. The Emergency Housing Fund has helped 12 families avoid eviction, and the Legal Aid Program has handled 18 cases of financial fraud. Outstanding, I said. Watching a family of ducks paddle across the lake like they own the place, which I guess they did. What's our current funding situation? Stable and growing, said Tom, our treasurer, who is some kind of accountant wizard that Marcus had recommended. The monthly restitution payments provide a solid foundation, and we've got 3 corporate sponsors signed up for next year. Plus, that veterans organization in Texas wants to partner with us on a pilot program. Every month, Marissa's court-ordered payments helped another family avoid the kind of financial devastation she tried to inflict on me. Every dollar she earned folding sweaters at the mall became hope for someone else. Support for people who'd served their country and deserved better than being screwed over by the people they trusted most. The phone that used to buzz with 467 missed calls from a desperate cheating ex-wife had been silent for months now. Not because I'd blocked her number. I'd actually kept the same phone, the same number, everything the same. But because she'd finally figured out that I wasn't going to answer, wasn't going to engage, wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she could still get a reaction out of me. Silence, as it turns out, is the most powerful weapon in the human arsenal. Not the kind of silence that comes from being speechless or scared or overwhelmed, but the kind that comes from having absolutely nothing left to say to someone who's proven they're not worth the energy it takes to form words. I didn't hate Marissa anymore. Hate requires caring, and caring requires emotional investment. And I divested myself of any feelings about her with the same clinical efficiency I'd used to protect my assets. She was just a person who used to be in my life, like a high school classmate or a former co-worker, someone I could remember without feeling anything particular about the memories. I didn't forgive her either, because forgiveness implies that what she did was forgivable. And betraying your deployed spouse while stealing their money and lying to their face falls pretty firmly in the unforgivable category. But I also didn't need forgiveness, didn't need closure, didn't need any of those therapeutic concepts that people throw around when they're trying to process trauma and move forward. I just needed distance, physical distance, emotional distance, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. As I sat there on my deck, watching the sun come up over water that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time, I realized that revenge isn't always fire and fury and dramatic confrontations that leave everyone bloody and broken. Sometimes revenge is just living well, building something meaningful, and never looking back at the wreckage you left behind. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who's hurt you is to prove that you're better off without them. And that silence, my my choice, my freedom was louder than any scream Marissa could ever make.